Thank you. Yeah, I'm 50 today, and I'm not dead either. At least I don't think I am. Sheep pen time. Y'all probably wondering, where in the world's he going with this one? I don't really know. So let's just all grab a hold. Cindy called me yesterday wanting to know where the outline is, and I just said it ain't happening. And it wasn't at that particular time, but I believe God has something that he wants to communicate today, and he's going to give me the ability to be able to do that, and he's going to show up here today, and he's going to speak a word into your life that relates to your situation. And we're going to pick up reading right here, sheep pen time, 1 Samuel chapter 16, beginning in verse number 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Pick it up in verse number 13. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, David here, in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. David became a part of the service of Saul, because verse number 14 tells us, now when the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's attendant said to him, see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants to search for someone who can play the harp. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better. So Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays and bring him to me. One of his servants answered, I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play it. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Now get this. David is anointed to be the next king. This is not going to happen for quite some time. But as soon as David is anointed, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. The Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul. An evil spirit comes upon him. And then David is the one chosen to be able to play the music when the evil spirit is tormenting Saul, so that the evil spirit will be chased away. Psalm 78, beginning in verse number 70. He chose David, his servant, and took him, where did he take him from? From the sheep pens, from tending the sheep. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. I got that thought in my mind. He took them from the sheep pens. He took them from tending sheep. You know, because as we study the Word of God, it's encouraging to me, and I'm sure it is to you, that you can look through the Bible and you can see that God didn't choose these ones that had all this wisdom, or had all this education, or they were the who's who and somebody. He just chose regular, ordinary men and women to do an extraordinary work through them to be able to further his kingdom here on this earth. And God does that over and over all through the Old Testament. And David here is one of them. God chose David. If you look there, it says that God chose David. And where did he choose David from? He chose him from the sheep pens. And it was in the sheep pens to where David got the training and the skill and learned all of these virtues and learned all of these things about God through tending sheep, and learned these skills of being able to protect his sheep that would leap him into being a mighty warrior, a brave warrior for God. And this is going to be a stepping stone for him. And what I want to talk about this morning as we look at the sheep pens of life is that you can't skip the sheep pen, because God has something to do in your heart and in your life that can only be done in the sheep pen, to teach you things so that you can mature and grow and be grounded and learn things about God and learn things about yourself and become skillful. And that's what it is that God has called you to do. And with God, everything has a time and a place, and God has a purpose for you, but you'll not get to that purpose until to that destiny, the pinnacle of being used by God in a mighty way, and skip the sheep pens. Everybody's got to go through the sheep pens, and that's where God called David from. Now get it, the picture here. He calls them from the sheep pens, and he's going to call them all the way to the palace. I mean, he's going to go from being a dirty shepherd boy to being the king of Israel. And he is chosen by God to shepherd the nation of Israel. Now, Saul was a man's man. Saul was one of those that you looked at and he looked like a king. He stood head and shoulders above everybody else. A tall man, big in stature, broad shoulders. And he was the people's choice. So when it came time for God to select his choice, he makes it clear that don't look on his outward appearance. He's not going to be as tall as Saul was. Shoulders are not going to be as broad as his was. And he might not look like a king, but you got to realize that how I'm choosing a king is different than the way man chooses. Man chooses by looking at the outside, and God says, I'm choosing a man who is going to be right with me on the inside, whose heart is completely mine. So don't look at the outward, look at the inward, because it is on the inward man that those outward things of God can manifest themselves in a way that will make him a braver man than Saul, a greater warrior than Saul, a greater king than Saul, because God was with him in everything that he does. Now notice the reason why God chose him. He chose him because of his heart. His heart was completely his. Let me give you these two verses. Second Chronicles 16:9 says, the eyes of the Lord are running throughout the earth, looking to strengthen those whose hearts are completely his. So let me ask you this morning, where's your heart? Is your heart completely his this morning? Is your heart this morning undivided, singly focused on God? That's where David was. Acts 13:22, Paul said, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Did you know that David is mentioned in the Bible more than any other character in the Bible? He's mentioned more than Moses, more than Abraham. He's mentioned more than Jesus. This man is mentioned all through the Old Testament, and he's mentioned all in the New Testament. And when we think about David, you could throw some things out there. And the things that you would throw out there, yeah, he's the one that took down Goliath. And you would talk about some of these mighty things that he accomplished. But he also had some huge failures in his life. He had some collapses in his life morally. He did some terrible acts of wickedness. But he is identified by God as being a man after his own heart. And in the New Testament, nowhere in the New Testament does God identify David of his sins or of his failures. He's identified as a man who had a heart for me, because David, when he was confronted with sin in his life, even if he had went a time to where that sin was covered, when he was confronted, he immediately, it grieved him. He repented. He wanted to make it right with God. He said, I've sinned against God. So God said he was a man whose heart was after my heart. So he went from the sheep pens all the way to being a mighty warrior for God, a little humble shepherd boy to a mighty king, chosen by God and chosen right out of the sheep pens, because the way God chooses is different. God says the last shall be first. God says in the New Testament that those that humble themselves are going to be what? They're going to be exalted. And that's what David had. David was last. He didn't mind being a shepherd boy. He loved being a shepherd boy. He loved his sheep. And he plugged himself in and he gave his all. And he was faithful to that task. But he also had a spirit of humility. And he had a heart that was completely owned by God. And at the right time, God took that spirit of humility and exalts him to a higher position, because in the sheep pens, he's learned all these things that he needed to be able to be a great king, to be able to be a king for God, to be able to be a king who would see things through the eyes of God and have a heart that would beat in rhythm with God. You see, you only learn those things in the sheep pen. So this morning we're going to talk about sheep pen time. Point number A in your notes. Sheep pen time is a time of development. Just as a newborn baby comes out and they have to grow, they can't do anything for themselves. It's not going to be long. They're going to be able to do some stuff. Not anything for themselves, but they're going to be able to cause a destructive mess. And they go through that learning process, the development process. You can't skip it. Nobody comes out from being a child, a little baby, to being an adolescent. You got to go through the process. You got to go through the development. Now notice it says here that David's skills, it says in and these are the verses that caught my attention, verse 72, and David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skilled hands, he led them. Now he had skilled hands. There was some skills he learned that he could do with his hands, and there were a lot of skills that he learned that he exercised with his heart, with a heart of integrity and a heart of character. He didn't have a glamorous job. He didn't have a glamorous position. He was just old dirty, stinking shepherd boy, having to sleep with the sheep, having to sit there and take care of them and show them love and compassion. But he did it. And it was during this time, the sheep pen time, that he went through the development, and all of the things that he learned during this time are going to be put into place in his kingship as he is exalted all the way to the palace. All of those things that were developed in the sheep pen, he is going to use and exercise as he works his way up to being exactly where God had chosen him to be. See, sometimes we don't like it in the sheep pens, because you know what? In the sheep pens, it's lonely. It was lonely out there for David. There wasn't a lot of people out there with David. There wasn't a lot of people out there patting him on the back, telling him what a great shepherd boy you are. Nobody wanted to touch him because he was dirty and nasty. It was a thankless job. It was a smelly job. It was a lowly job. It was such a lowly job that you remember on the night that Jesus makes his entrance into this world and Mary gives birth to him. The first ones to hear about it are the what? Are the shepherds. And God's sending us a message that the shepherds, the lowliest people in that day and in that culture, as low as you could go to be a shepherd boy, the message of a Savior had been born, appeared to them first, letting everybody know that God will go all the way to the lowest of lows to reach anybody, and nobody can go so low that his grace and his love cannot reach down and redeem them and give them life. So a time of development. We call it preparation time, prep time. Prep time where you get grounded. You get ready for prime time. You see, most people today just want to go to prime time. They want to skip the prep time and they want to go all the way out there where it's really happening at. But you know what? If God puts you out there, you wouldn't be ready for it. If God puts you out there without going through the prep time and without going through the sheep pen time, you wouldn't be no good for Him. You would destroy a lot of relationships. You wouldn't have the people skills and the humility and the grace and the kindness and the love and the forgiveness and the attitudes that you would need to be able to do what it was that God was calling you to do. See, in these sheep pens, this is where David became a skilled, fierce warrior. This is where he learned how to use that slingshot. Because you see, Goliath wasn't the first giant he took down. The Bible tells us that he took out bears and he took out lions and he took them out with his slingshot. He got so good with his slingshot, and the reason why he got good with it was because he was responsible for those sheep. He had to protect those sheep. So when it came time for God to take him from prep time to prime time, that's the reason why he looked at Goliath and he said, "You're not going to taunt my God that way. Who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is to talk about the armies of the living God in the way that he is? I'll go out there and I'll take him down." And you knew why he was confident? You knew why he knew that he could take him out? Is because he'd spent all that time in the sheep pens. He spent all that time. He knew what he was skilled at doing, and he knew that God would take that rock and plant it right in the middle of his head, because David had already learned at a very young age, my heart beats in rhythm with God. And I know his heart, and he knows my heart. And I'm close to him. And I have communion with him. And I mean, I know him. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about God. That's how close David was to God. That's how much of his heart God had. He had all of it. And that's the reason why he was able to be a great king. It was here that he learned responsibility. He learned the skill of being able to nurture and to care for these sheep. It was here that he learned how to love. You see, the Bible says that if a person does not have love, it does not matter the great acts that he does. It does not matter how well he can sing or how well he can speak or how much money he can give or how much education that he has. If a man does not have love, all of those things will just be loud noise that won't accomplish anything. But if a man has love, he doesn't have to have nowhere near the pedigree and nowhere near the money and nowhere near the giftedness. If he's got love and he's got the anointing of God, he can do great things as a servant of God. And these things were developed in the sheep pen. It was a time of development. Second of all, B, it was a time of discipline. Discipline. This is where David's heart of integrity was developed. You say, what would be the discipline in the sheep pens? You know, kind of like we really talk about it all the time. What'd you do this week? If you're not retired, you did the same thing you did the week before. You got up and you had to what? You went to work. You punched the clock or whatever you did. Or if you work on your own, whatever. You worked and you got up Tuesday and you did it again, Wednesday and you did it again. And you know what? You do that what? Week after week after week after week. And you know what? We don't realize it, but that takes, some people can't hold a job. And the majority of the people that can't hold a job is, first of all, they probably don't have any people skills, but they don't have any discipline. They don't want to work. And God says if a man don't work, a man don't what? A man don't eat. So it takes a lot of discipline just to do the very basic things in life. So it was the same thing day after day for David. David woke up with the sheep. He was out there. He slept with them. He was out there to protect them, to nurture them, to care for them. He was out there to be able to check over their whole bodies and to be able to make sure they didn't have any infections and to make sure they didn't have any diseases. And it was this routine. It was this responsibility. Responsibility, day in, day out. Get up, work hard, give it your all. And it was the ability to be able to do that when nobody was looking. Nobody was patting them on the back. Discipline is the ability to be able to do something on your own, and you don't have to have somebody there to make you do it. You're able to be faithful and do it because you know that's what you're supposed to do. Even if you don't want to do it, you do it because you know that's what you're supposed to do. And that's what David learned. He learned how to be faithful in the small things. See, some of us sitting back talking about how we want God to do something bigger. We want Him to do something bigger in our lives. We want Him to give us more responsibility. We want Him to promote us on the job site where we can make more money, bless our business so we can make more money. But we don't realize we're not ready for it. You might not be disciplined enough. Matter of fact, going up the ladder might actually bring you down with God, because you're not disciplined enough to take Him up with you. And if you try to go there on your own, you won't be ready for it. And if you're not ready for it, you're just going to make a mess out of it. The question is, are you being faithful with what you got? Are you being faithful with what you have? Are you faithful in the job that you have? Are you faithful with the giftedness that God has already given you? Are you faithful in the small things when nobody else is looking? Time of discipline. See, maybe right now you're in the sheep pen. And you know what? It stinks in the, I got to make sure when I'm saying that word, sheep. It stinks in there with those sheep. I mean, it stinks. It's not pleasant in there. And you know, there's sometimes we go through phases in our lives to where we're not where we want to be. Matter of fact, we're not even where we thought we would be. And it's easy for the enemy to use that against us because it's just not pleasant. It's just, we're in the sheep pen. We just feel alone. We just feel abandoned. And we just feel like we're there. Nobody notices. Nobody sees us. My life's not making a difference in anybody else's life. Well, let me just give you some good news this morning. Let me remind you this morning that God's not wasting your time today. He's not wasting your time because He's preparing you for tomorrow. You see, every day David went out there in that sheep pen, he may have felt that way some days. But you know what? God wasn't wasting his time. God was preparing him for the time to come. And that's what you need to remember. You could be impacting more lives right now than you could ever imagine. And God, right now, wherever you're at, in the job that you're at, in the neighborhood that you live in, and whatever it is, whatever sheep pen God's got you in, you're there for a reason. He's not wasting your time. He's getting you ready and prepared for tomorrow. Because if you learn what you need to learn in the sheep pen, and you're able to have that spirit of humility and to be able to depend on God and be desperate for God and seek after God, He will elevate you at the right time, and you'll be ready for it and prepared for it. Number 3, point C, in the sheep pen is where it's time to make decisions. Now, think about this with me. They say that if you read, it doesn't spell it out for us directly, but they say that David was a young teenager when he was anointed to be the king. Now, he's anointed, he's not going to be the king. If any of you have been coming on Wednesday night, you know that it's going to be years, because Saul is going to chase him around and hunt him down, and he's going to be on the run. And if you've been to Wednesday night Bible studies, It takes a while from point A to point B for God to get them there. So it's going to still take more patience for David. But he was a young teenage boy when he is anointed. So that means he was probably a shepherd boy at a very, very young age. And at this very young age, he had already made some big decisions for God. You see, in the sheep pen is where you make those big decisions. In the sheep pen is where you make those decisions that God's going to have my whole heart. He's going to have all of it. I'm surrendering all of it to Him. I'm giving it all to Him. I'm going to love Him, and I'm going to live for Him, and I'm going to serve Him. You see, if you don't make those decisions, they don't just happen. You have to make them. And those are life decisions. You know, there's a lot of people that you read tell you that if you make one big decision, that you're going to live for God and His heart is going to be completely yours. That takes care of a lot of other decisions. They're already taken care of. You've already answered them because you said, as for me and my life, I'm going to honor God, I'm going to serve God, and I'm going to love God. And if it don't pass the honor God, love God, serve God, then it's no. David made these choices as a young teenager. How important it is for us to pour into our children. I mean, this wasn't the first information that David had about God. He already had a relationship with God. He already had a heart that was completely His. He already knew who God was, and his heart was beating in the same rhythm with God. And he made some big decisions to have a faithful heart. You see, that's how you're faithful, is you make a big decision to be faithful. That's how you're faithful in anything. With your money, with your services, with your giftedness, whatever it is that you've got to make a decision on, you won't be faithful in it if you don't say, God, I'm going to be faithful in this area of my life. It won't happen. You might be faithful for a while, but it was a part of who David was. Those things happen in the sheep pen. As you're developed, as you're disciplined, as you make those decisions, they become a part of who you are, and that is my next point. In the sheep pen, point D is a time for you to be defined. So think about it this morning. What defines you this morning as a man? What defines you this morning as a woman? What defines your family? What defines where you're at right now and where you're going? There is a definition of your life. You might not even know what that definition is, but there's a definition. And it's either all about you or all about God. No in between. You're either in for God or trying to act like you're in for God and not in for God, trying to fool all of those that are in for God, but those that are in for God are completely connected with their heart to God, and they can see right through those that are just pretending to be, but not. You see, this is where the definition of your life begins to write itself out and ink itself out of who you are and what you're going to be. I'm going to love God. That's what David said. He loved what God loved. He hated what God hated. If God was for it, he was for it. If God was against it, he was against it. If somebody taunted God, talked down about the children of Israel and the armies of the living God, he was going to step up and say something about it. That lets you know that everybody out there on those battle lines, this has been going on for days, where Goliath would come out, the champion of the Philistines, and he would taunt them and say, send somebody out from your ranks to fight with me. And you know what? Day after day after day after day, nobody would make the stand. Nobody would say, who's going to let him do this? and step out there and fight them? Nobody. Until David showed up. And you know why David showed up? Because he was bringing his brothers lunch. You talk about what was he doing? He was performing the work of a servant. Doing what his dad told him. Go check on your brothers and take them lunch. And it was in the midst of having a servant's heart that he showed up that day at about the time Goliath is taunting the children of Israel. And he said, oh, no. I can't believe y'all let this go on for as long as this went on. You see, because those who are in love with God and those whose heart is connected to God see things, hear things, perceive things, and are sensitive in ways that other people that don't have that relationship with God cannot relate to, cannot comprehend, will not ever be able to relate to it, will not ever be able to comprehend it because they're not there. David had that insight with God, and all that training and all that skill showed up right there, front and center, for David to be able to display to the children of Israel that a little old shepherd boy can stand out here and do what all these tall, big men that say they are somebody are not willing to step out there and even to attempt. Because when God is for you, it doesn't matter who's against you. When God's on your side, it doesn't matter who's on the other side. Because God will give you the victory. And just like those Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's head, God can deliver us from that fire. But if He chooses not to, it's not because He can't. And we still won't bow. We'll give our lives for Him. Why? Because they already had made some decisions that we love God. And we're going to honor God and worship God and live for God. And anything that does not pass that bar, we won't do. So we're not bowing to your image, and we serve and notice on you today that's not going to happen. Do whatever it is you need to do. Because we're going to serve God and love God. Think about it. His heart was connected to the heart of God. Let me give you some things here that happened in the sheep pen, to where David actually was able to develop these things in his life. First of all, he had charisma. Some people just have good charisma, but when you have a God charisma, you can do some great things. David had that God charisma in his life. And if you study his life, and you'll have to read it from the time that he kills Goliath and he becomes the person that's playing to be able to chase the evil spirit away, it's not going to be long. Saul's going to turn on him. And David's going to be on the run. He's going to be hunted. He's going to be the most wanted man in Israel because Saul is trying to kill him. And even in the midst of this time, there were people that were willing to follow David and be there for David even before he was king, because he had that charisma of being able to lead men, of being a leader, being a warrior for God, a conquering spirit on the inside of them. And other men were just drawn to that. And people were drawn to that because they could sense that spirit, and it was the Spirit of God. And it was not anything to do with self and flesh. Second of all, he not only had charisma, but he had patience. Anointed king and on the run for probably 20-something years before he took the throne. That's patience. Hunted down by Saul, waiting to be king over all Israel. Think about his humility. He's anointed to be the king. He's on the run running for his life. He could have demanded to have that position because he had already been anointed by God, but he had a spirit of humility. He didn't demand anything. And anybody with a spirit of humility and and a spirit that is linked up with God, you don't demand things in life. Not that you don't ask for certain things, but if it doesn't go your way, you're most certainly never going to demand it and say, I'm going to have my way no matter what. No, you don't do that. God's in control. And with a spirit of humility, you realize that. He had courage. He was sensitive. Not sensitive, we say people are sensitive and it's not a good thing. He was sensitive, and it was a good thing because it was with God. He could hear the voice of God. He was in tune with God. So David, when he had moral failures in his life, and he was going right along like he didn't do anything wrong, when Nathan confronted him and said, you are the man, there's sin in your life, what did he immediately do? Immediately, he was sensitive to God. I've sinned against God. You read his Psalms and you can see Psalms 51, Psalms 32. Here was a man that was broken, a man that was filled with guilt and shame, a man that understood what repentance was all about. He had broken the heart of God. He had broken and shattered the lives of others. And now he was broken over his sin. That's the reason why he had a heart for God. Because there's none of us that are going to be without sin. The question is, what do you do in your life when there is sin? Do you own it? Do you step up and admit it and say, yes, it's me. I sinned. I did wrong. It's my fault. I make no excuses. I don't put the blame on anybody else. It was me. I sinned. I sinned against God and I sinned against others. That's what David said. Is that what you say? Is that what I say? Think about forgiveness. See, David forgave, and if you don't study his life, you don't know this. But David actually did love his enemies. He actually was willing over and over to give people second chances. Rebels that went on their own and went against whatever it was that he was doing. He gave them second chances, and he forgave, probably in the Bible, more than anybody other than Jesus. And then he showed kindness. Because when he was king, if you study his life, you'll see that there came a time when he said, is there anybody left from the house of Saul? From that king that was trying to kill me, is there anybody left that I can show kindness to? That I can be good to? That I can bless? And then he was gracious. He was on the run from Saul. And if you'll read in the Old Testament, you'll find that there were 2 times David is standing right over Saul, his friends advising him to take him out and kill him because he's right there with the opportunity to do it. But David would not do it. And you know why he wouldn't do it? He says, because I'm not going to put my hand on God's anointed. What he's doing is wrong, but God hasn't kicked him out yet and put me in. He's still anointed from God. He still has that position, and I will not step in and take the place of God. That's graciousness, because most of us would just look for the opportunity to be able to get somebody that was trying to get us. And you know what? He learned all of this, and you know where he learned it at? He learned it in the sheep pen, because that's where you grow character at. You see, there's things you learn in the sheep pen that you'll never learn in a classroom, and you'll never learn by reading a book. You can learn about them in a classroom. You can learn about them as you read. But the only way to learn them is in the sheep pen. You got to be down there in the trenches. You got to be down there in the trenches laboring for God, striving for God. That's where you learn humility. That's where you learn patience. That's where you learn how to have a kind heart and a gracious heart. That's where you learn how to forgive, how to love your enemies, how to be able to do good by those who are despitefully using you. You learn all of that down in the trenches, in the sheep pens, so that when you get to where God wants you to get and you're in prime time and you're there for other people to be able to look up to, you have progressed to a point to where God is able to use you. You got to be ready for it. And the only way to get ready for it is in the sheep pen. Because there's some people, we've done it before. I've seen it so many times to where you can take something like just say a restaurant, and you put a girl in charge of being a manager of the other girls. The girl that you put in charge to be a manager of the other girls was a great worker, just being a worker. But she would become a manager of the other girls and turn into Lucifer. Why? Because she had something that she didn't have the day before. Authority. I can tell you what to do now. I'm the boss. And you know what? A lot of people, even as simple things like that in life, just aren't ready to handle it, because you don't really become the in charge person. Because if you learn anything from watching David, and I've always taught my kids, listen, don't go around pointing your fingers, telling everybody else what they're supposed to do. Get in there and do it with them. Get in there. If you're the boss and you're the manager and you're in charge, you get your hands dirty. You get in there and sweat with them. You get in there and let them see that if you can do it, they better do it. Whole different ball game. You tell people to do something, it doesn't always work. So what are we left with? 4 things right here in closing. Zip right through them. First of all, David was a follower. He was a follower of God, not a follower of men, but he was a follower of God. So that's the first question this morning is, who are you following? Where is your heart? Is your heart completely his? That word integrity literally means without hypocrisy. It means to be single-minded. Where's your heart this morning? Not that you're perfect and got everything lined up, but is your heart beaten with God, and is the desire of your heart and of your life to honor him and to please him? He was a follower. Second of all, he was faithful. He was faithful. Are you faithful this morning in what God has put into your life? Whatever it is, whatever sheep pen you're in, whatever job you're working, whatever, if you're a dad, if you're a mom, if you're a husband or your wife, are you faithful in the things that God has put right there in front of you? Are you faithful with your money? Are you faithful with the gifts, skills, and abilities? See, some of you might not be being faithful because you've got skills and abilities that nobody else knows anything about. Some of you out there can play the drums. You just hadn't told nobody you can play the drums, because if you tell somebody you can play the drums, then we're going to count on you to be up here to play the drums. Some of you out there can play another instrument. Some of you out there have beautiful voices. You can sing, and you know you can sing, and you know you've been gifted by God to sing, and you know you're supposed to be singing. But if you don't tell nobody, then they won't expect nothing out of you. See, that just simply means you're just not being faithful. Because whatever it is that you have in your life, whatever that giftedness is, even if it's being a shepherd boy in the trenches, tending the sheep, behind the scenes serving, are you being faithful with what God has given you? David was. In his worship, in his walk, in his work, he was faithful. Third of all, David was a fighter. Not a fighter as in picking a fight, but he was a warrior for God. He was a fighter. This soldier, what we've been talking about this year, this was a man, a king who had his boots on the ground. I mean, he was down there. David was a man of war. He wasn't a man that would send his men out. He would go with them. He would lead his men. He was a man of valor and a man of war. He was a fighter. And ultimately what he was fighting for was fighting for the kingdom of God, fighting for the rule of God, for the will of God. What are you fighting for today? Are the things you fighting for physical? Are you fighting with others? Are you fighting to get your way? Are you fighting to be able to get a promotion that God just hasn't released anybody else to give you, and you're trying to force it and fight for it? Or are you fighting for God? You see, most of the time when you're fighting for God, nobody is going to know you're fighting, because this is a spiritual war. It's fought so much different than a physical war. But they're going to know where your heart is. They're going to know how you're in rhythm with God. They're going to see that in your life. They're going to see that devotion, and they're going to know you're not intimidated like David. You're not intimidated by what you see. You're not intimidated by what you hear. Your confidence is in God. Doesn't matter what the doctor says. Doesn't matter what that person over there says about you. Your confidence and your faith is rooted in God, and nothing intimidates you in life. Not that you're not overwhelmed sometimes, because you are. And you know what? David he wrote so many songs. It was literally like he was a poet. Now, just think about the giftedness of this young man. He was a fighter, a warrior. He was a poet. He was a songwriter. So many of the songs that are being sung today, so many of the Casting Crown songs that are being sung today are taken right out of the pages of the Old Testament that David wrote, pouring his heart out to God. And in a journal sometimes to where he would just express things that you could only express if your heart was connected with God. He would be so low and so down and discouraged in one part of the psalm, and then immediately come back up, because immediately my eyes looked to the hills and I saw my God, and the light shined down into that darkness and down into that valley, and I saw that there still was hope. He wrote these journals of his life and things that he struggled with and dealt with, and was able to write them in such a way to where it has spoke to so many people down through the years, that no matter what you're going through, no matter how distressed you are, no matter how difficult it is, there's hope. There's hope. And then fourth of all, he was a finisher. We got a lot of people that get started, but not a whole lot of people that finish. Because if you finish, that means that you start when God speaks to your heart, as David did as a young teenager, and you don't quit until death. You don't take time off from God. You take time off from work. You don't take time off from God. You know, we are to be serving God every day of our lives. I'm not saying God doesn't call you from one ministry to another. God doesn't say, okay, this time for you in this area is over, and I'm going. But he doesn't say this is over for you. Sit down, sit back, and relax for a while. No, you don't want God to relax on your behalf, do you? See, he's a finisher. He's faithful. He's good. He's good all the time. You don't want him to quit on you. So don't quit on him. Serve wherever you're. And it's really not one of those things that's even up for debate, because if you do like David down there in the sheep pen, go ahead and make that decision. As for you in your life, you're going to honor God and serve God and be faithful to God and love him above everything else. All of those other things find their place. And God will take you from one ministry to another ministry, one workplace to another workplace, one department to another department, and you know what? You'll be doing the same thing you did in the other one, because that big decision you made in your life to honor God and to serve God took care of all those others. So you're in the sheep pen, and you want out of the sheep pen. And there's nothing wrong with wanting out of the sheep pen. But don't want out so bad that you run ahead of God, because you're not wasting your time in the sheep pen. God is doing something and preparing you for something bigger down the road, better down the road, something that's going to be more of a blessing and a greater blessing in your life. The sheep pens are not always the easiest place to be, but that's where God develops us. That's where God changes us. That's where He molds us. And whatever He's doing in your life, just make sure you're following those things. Make sure you're following Him. Make sure, what was that second one? Fight was the second one. Faithful. Follow. See, y'all done forgot. Y'all writing them down. Follow. Are you faithful? Are you a fighter? And are you finishing? Wherever you're at in that journey, just keep on keeping on for God. And wherever you're at in that journey, if you want to quit, don't quit. Come recommit yourself today. Recommit your family today. God's saying you need to make those big decisions for you, for your family, you and your future, whatever it is. Do what God's telling you to do. You won't regret it. Go all the way, all in for Him, and you won't regret it. It won't always be easy, but it's the best route to go, is all in, all the way with God. Let's stand by our heads.